Before this video begins, I would like to say a couple things. First off, this video is a remake of a previous video I made on the channel by the same name. After much thinking, I decided that scenario wasn't very good, and I chose to make a better version of it. If you have seen that first video, some of what I will discuss will sound familiar on the history part, but the alternative history has been completely altered. I would like to thank Mad Mossier 6422 for some of the ideas I discuss in this video. The scenario in this video is not exactly the same as the scenario he left in my comments, but I did draw some inspiration from his comments. After you're done watching this video, you should go check out his comments on the first video and read his ideas, as he goes into a lot more detail about a lot more things than I did, and I find his comments to be very educational. Now that that's out of the way, let us begin the scenario.
When we talk about the Cold War, we often think of it as being a two-sided conflict, the two sides being the United States and the Soviet Union. It's understandable why some people would have such a view on this era of history, as we tend to ignore the countless other less influential factions of this conflict. Everyone knows that after World War II, Europe was divided between the West Bloc, the side of liberalization, freedom, and the free market, and the East Bloc, the side of communism and the liberation of the working class. What lots of people don't know, however, is that there were a handful of countries all over the world that did not align with either side. One of these countries was Yugoslavia, which was a nation located in the Balkans, a region in Eastern Europe. After World War II, Yugoslavia became a socialist state governed by the League of Communists of Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia was friendly with the Soviets immediately after World War II, but very quickly began making decisions without consulting the Soviets and asserting its own influence in the Balkans, which made the Soviets feel threatened. This quickly led to conflicts between the two nations and resulted in a diplomatic split between them. Yugoslavia even started having closer diplomatic relations with Western nations. Yugoslavia made it clear from the get-go that they wanted to be respected as an independent nation that acts of its own accord, rather than a nation that is subjected to the will of the Soviet Union or the United States. How might things play out differently if Yugoslavia remained in the East Bloc? Let's take a look at the history of this interesting nation and find out. Yugoslavia began as a loose idea of unifying the southern Slavs under one flag. How this would be carried out was debated. Serbs wanted a centralized state so that ethnic Serbs could be united across the Balkans, whereas Croats wanted a decentralized state that would allow for regional autonomy of all of its ethnic populations. After the absolute slog that took place in World War I, the Kingdom of Yugoslavia would be formed in 1929, and it would come under the unopposed rule of Alexander I. Alexander failed to quell ethnic division within the kingdom, and it came to a sudden end in April 1941 when the Axis powers invaded and partitioned its land. Within the area of what was formerly Yugoslavia, two ideological factions would emerge, that being the Chetniks, who were a Serbian nationalist movement that switched between fighting with and against the Axis depending on the situation, and the Partisans, who believed in equality for all Southern Slavs through socialism. The Partisans, led by Josip Broz Tito, would emerge as the victorious faction by the end of the war. This is for a couple reasons. The Chetniks consisted mostly of former soldiers of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia who were Serbian nationalists and were therefore not seen as Yugoslav fighters. It also didn't help that they would collaborate with their German and Italian colonizers from time to time, as mentioned earlier. The Partisans, on the other hand, consisted of Southern Slavs not just from Serbia, but from Croatia, Bosnia, Macedonia, and Slovenia. They were also based in the mountainous regions of Yugoslavia, which made it harder to reach them. The Partisans crushed the Chetniks and liberated themselves from Axis occupation, mostly on their own. Because of this, they were able to form their own government and write their own constitution under the oversight of Tito. Tito would model the government of Yugoslavia after that of the Soviet Union. making Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Montenegro, Serbia, and Macedonia their own republics within the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, and even within the Socialist Republic of Serbia there were two socialist autonomous provinces of Kosovo and Vojvodina. Each republic and autonomous region had a say in domestic and foreign policy. This model did not stop Tito from becoming the unopposed dictator of Yugoslavia from 1953 until his death in 1980. Tito immediately began asserting his influence throughout the Balkans despite not having the blessing or even the approval from the USSR. An example of this is when Yugoslavia sent support equipment to the Greek communists during the Greek Civil War. The USSR already agreed with Britain and the United States that Greece wouldn't be a part of its sphere of influence, so this was a really bad look for them. It took pressure from the Soviets on the Greek communists to get them to stop accepting Yugoslav support equipment. Another example is when Yugoslavia began negotiations with Bulgaria for unification. The USSR was not totally opposed to the idea of a Yugoslavia that included Bulgaria, but they were furious over the fact that these discussions were taking place without the Soviet Union. The negotiations never went anywhere, and to be frank, they never really had a chance of getting anywhere, but it wasn't about that. It was about the fact that two East Bloc nations were acting of their own accord without the presence of the USSR.
Another very important example of this kind of behavior from Yugoslavia was when they contested Italian claims on Istria. Yugoslavia would end up annexing Istria in the end, but completely without the approval or accordance of the USSR. This assertion of independent influence from Moscow was scary to the USSR for two reasons. The first reason was that the USSR was scared that Yugoslavia could set up its own sphere of influence in the Balkans that would gut Soviet influence in Eastern Europe. And the second being that they didn't want the independent actions of Yugoslavia to drag them into a conflict with the West. Things would reach a boiling point when Yugoslavia established military bases in Albania even after the USSR told them not to do so. The USSR and Yugoslavia would proceed to sanction each other, and the two countries would bicker with each other through letters between Tito and Stalin. After much bickering between Tito and Stalin, Yugoslavia would be expelled from the Cominform, an international organization of communist parties collaborating with each other to create a unified movement. Tito would kick off a series of Stalin-style purges against pro-Soviet communists in Yugoslavia. An invasion of Yugoslavia was on the table for the USSR, but the Korean War being kicked off would shift priority away from Yugoslavia. The relationship between these two nations would remain sour for the rest of their existence. What can we change to keep Yugoslavia under Soviet influence? One way we can keep Yugoslavia on good terms with the USSR is by having them negotiate how Yugoslavia could predict its influence throughout Eastern Europe. Perhaps the two countries can come to an agreement on what each other's spheres of influence would look like in Eastern Europe, but I personally don't think this is likely, as the biggest point of the Stalin-Tito split was literally over this very issue. I think the easiest way to keep Yugoslavia in the East Bloc is if Stalin manages to assassinate Tito. Stalin made multiple attempts to assassinate Tito in our own timeline. It isn't unthinkable that maybe one of these attempts could go a little less well for Tito. If this happened, a power vacuum would be opened in Yugoslavia at the start of the Cold War, and the USSR would send troops to occupy Belgrade and other major cities to establish a pro-Soviet government in Yugoslavia. The transition of leadership would be painted as a natural continuation of the old Yugoslav government. All anti-Soviet communists in Yugoslavia are purged from leadership. I think that in this timeline, Bosnia and Croatia managed to break off from Yugoslavia, and Slovenia would merge with Croatia under an anti-communist American-backed Croatian state. Italy would occupy the lost land of Istria and the Italian-majority region of Dalmatia. The USSR would dissolve the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, and all of its remaining members would be absorbed into the Serbian Socialist Republic, who would work to repress its minorities. Both Yugoslavia and Croatia would invade Bosnia, and Serb rebels in Bosnia would form pro- and anti-communist movements. This new Soviet Yugoslavia would support the Serbian communists. It it wouldn't take long for nationalist uprisings to pop up all over Soviet Yugoslavia. The USSR would have the consolidation of its regime in Yugoslavia as a top priority, and how to handle this affair and the public attitude towards it would determine the leadership of the USSR.
The USSR still gives Manchuria to the Chinese communists, and they still win the Chinese Civil War. With that being said, the USSR wouldn't be interested in involving itself in Korea or Vietnam, due to their efforts in Yugoslavia shifting the priority. I believe that China would have a harder time trying to preserve North Korea due to lack of Soviet assistance, but North Korea would still manage to be preserved, even if it loses more territory than in our own timeline. Vietnam, on the other hand, would be an American victory. There would also be no Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Who comes to power in the USSR and their attitudes towards Yugoslavia is impossible to say. I believe around the late 1970s, a figure like Gorbachev comes to prominence and pulls out of Yugoslavia, allowing the communist government to collapse. That wouldn't be the end of the conflict in Yugoslavia, however, as ethnic divisions would only allow the conflict to carry on. The USSR would collapse much like in our own timeline, only a tad bit sooner, probably around 1987. When the fighting would end in Yugoslavia is hard to say. If it were to end, it would probably be around the late 1990s. That is, if it ends at all. If fighting continues up into the 2000s, it's not completely unthinkable that it could turn into a proxy war between America and a post-Soviet Russia, with America and its allies supporting the Croats and Russia supporting the Serbs.
The end result would be a non-communist Vietnam, a smaller North Korea, an earlier collapse of the USSR, a larger Italy, stronger international support for the USA, and most importantly, a Yugoslavia that has been decimated 5 times harder than in real life. The fact is that without Tito, communism could not exist in Yugoslavia. As a matter of fact, without Tito, I don't think there could have been a functional post-World War II Yugoslavia. It was his ideas of ethnic unity of all Southern Slavs through socialism that enabled the existence of Yugoslavia after World War II. It was his death in our own timeline that sparked the chain of events that led to the collapse of Yugoslavia. If he died at the start of the Cold War, there would have been no way that the USSR could fully assert its influence over Yugoslavia. In our timeline, under the leadership of Tito, Yugoslavia actually flourished with market socialism. While free speech was still restricted, things were actually not too bad in Yugoslavia for a lot of its existence. In this timeline, there wasn't even that. Eastern Europe would be much more unstable than in our timeline, and the world all around would see major changes. What do you think would have happened if Yugoslavia stayed in the East Bloc? Feel free to let me know in the comments below, and feel free to like and subscribe, and thank you for watching.